Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hi folks, how you all doing? This is Joe Zagorski with another installment of the Pigskin Past. Tonight we wanted to talk a little bit about something that really doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, about those wild and crazy NFL fans. Now, if you're listening to this program, I'm guessing you're an NFL fan, and you probably have been for a while. Anyway, American citizens, since the days of Red Grange in the 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, they've accepted the popularity of pro football as an accepted fact of life. I mean, it's grown in popularity over the many different years. And during those years, college football in the 1920s was still the king in the eyes of many people, but pro football, just as an infant at that time, was growing in status, practically every year, in fact. And by the 1970s, the majority of the Americans who watched the game were starting to enjoy it more and more, to the point where they're hooked on it. I'm one of them. I can't get enough of it. And I'm guessing that if you're listening to this, you probably enjoy pro football very much too. Now, it was in the 1970s that the NFL Properties Division was formed, and they changed the life of pro football fans forever. They were, and they still are, the merchandising arm of the NFL. And before you knew it, many fans would show up at all the stadiums wearing team colors, team logos, team sweatshirts and hats and t-shirts, and it's been that way ever since. But, what about the fans themselves? I start to question myself about this. What kind of characteristics do they have? Well, what you have to do when you want to bring some measure of excitement to the NFL as a fan, I always look back to the 1970s. A radio sportscaster in Miami seemed to have changed everything. He's a guy by the name of Rick Weaver. He came up with some idea, really out of the blue, during the 1971 season of having Dolphins fans at the Orange Bowl in Miami bring their transistor radios to the game. Well, you're probably asking yourself, what's the big deal about that? Well, he also asked them to bring a white handkerchief to the game. It gets a little bit confusing. Well, those fans who were listening to the broadcasts in the stadium, this guy named Rick Weaver would tell the fans, when to wave their white handkerchiefs. It was usually after a big play or a touchdown by the Dolphins, but it was a pure genius type of an idea. Today, over 4 decades later, many Miami traditionalists at the Dolphins games continue to wave their white handkerchiefs after big Dolphin plays. At that time in 1971, I believe it was Larry Zonka and Jim Kick and Mercury Morris and even Coach Shula looking around at all these fans in the Orange Bowl waving their white handkerchiefs and wondering, wow, we've never seen this before. This is kind of unique. Well, a few years later, in 1975 to be precise, another broadcaster came up with a similar idea for his local team. Myron Cope was a longtime radio sportscaster for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it was he who came up with that splendid idea called the Terrible Towel. Today, everybody recognizes the Terrible Towel. Back at that time in 75, they were actually gold, and then there were some that were black as well. Today, they're pretty much all gold Terrible Towels, color-wise. But Steelers fans have been waving them since that 1975 season, and when the Steelers play away games, you still see a multitude of fans waving their Terrible Towels. It's sometimes you could think that the Pittsburgh Steelers fans have taken over other stadiums, especially if they're playing a team that doesn't sell so well as far as tickets. So the terrible towel has been proudly displayed, of course, in NFL stadiums, but specifically in Pittsburgh. It's quite a spectacle, to be honest with you. Now, all was not an achievement of a spectacular nature when it came to the fans of the NFL during the 1970s. Throughout the decade, when stadium security was nothing compared to what it is today, a new phenomenon occurred, and it was on an individualistic basis. You see, NFL fans who do not have an official field pass are never allowed to go onto the field. Now, sure, many hundreds of fans would run onto a field after, their team won a big game, specifically in the playoffs. We've seen that happen a lot. But they weren't really arrested or anything like that. They were just, told to get off the field. It's like, it happens. But during the course of a game, every now and then, one single man might decide to take it upon himself to run onto the field. Now, I don't know when it happened for the very first time, but the art of streaking, running onto a football field without any clothes on, seemed to enjoy its zenith during the 1970s. The culprit was quite similar in most instances. Yeah, sometimes it was a female, but more often than not it was a male, a young man in his late teens or early 20s who'd come out of nowhere and run onto the field naked, usually while both teams were in a huddle planning for their next play. The streaker in question was often intoxicated with alcoholic beverages, but others may have just been dared to do it by his friends to attempt such a crazy stunt as that. In the early days of streaking, the television networks covering the games actually showed the action. It was quite comical, to say the least. A naked man running onto the football field with no real destination in mind other than avoiding a crew of security personnel who were trying to chase him down. Sometimes the streaker would try to steal the football itself and run with it. The fans in the stands couldn't help but burst out in laughter, and the longer the streaker could elude the policemen and the security personnel chasing him down, the louder of an ovation he received from those fans in the stands. It didn't take long for everyone involved to realize that the only goal that a streaker would have in his own mind was to become famous, even just for a small moment. He craved attention, and if he could get it, especially national attention. The spectacle of Monday Night Football in the 1970s drew millions of people across the nation watching those games on their televisions. And the ratings that they got back then just completely dwarfed anything else that was on television at the time. Your typical streaker, he knew this. And he knew that if his act was captured on Monday Night Football, he could become legendary. And his act could be watched by millions of people across America. Now, it didn't take too many of these streaking episodes for the network, ABC, and other networks during the Sunday games to realize that if their cameras did not follow the streaker, his actions and subsequent arrest would not be aired, making any chance for his fame practically nil. Today, you might still come across a random streaker at a game, but you saw a lot of them during the 1970s and most often on Monday Night Football. Now, in our next edition of the Pigskin Past, we'll try to delve a little further into a chapter of pro football fandom with a story that might even be hard to believe even today. In fact, I can almost guarantee it. But for the Pigskin Past, this is Joe Zagorski, and thanks for listening.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football. Joe Zagorski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s. Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports. Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories. And Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.